Good afternoon. And welcome. My name is Dr. Joan Reed. I am Dean for Culture and Community Engagement and Professor of Medicine here at Harvard Medical School. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation and discussion on pluralism, featuring Dr. Diana Eck. This is co-organized with the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School, the Harvard School of Dental Medicine, and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Before we get started, I want you to note that this is being recorded, and that recording will be made available on our website, and that closed captioning is available. And after Dr. Eck's presentation, we'll invite questions from both our in-person audience as well as those watching virtually. The chat will not be available, but the Q&A function will be available. And we're so pleased that today's program has drawn broad interest, including from members of the media. And before we begin, I'd just like to remind individuals, we don't have the slide today of part of our rules for the road, and it's really about how we respect one another, listen to one another in times of discussion and dialogue. Now for the feature of today. Diana Eck is Professor of Comparative Religion and Indian Studies Emerita at Harvard University, and Frederic Wertham Research Professor of Law and Psychiatry in Society. She's also founder and director of the Pluralism Project, which for nearly 30 years has studied the changing religious landscape of America and its significance for American society. A scholar of India, she turned her attention to the United States with the Pluralism Project and has produced extensive web-based resources for understanding multi-religious and multicultural America. She's written Encountering God, A Spiritual Journey from Bozeman to Benares, and A New Religious America, How a Christian Country Has Become the World's Most Religiously Diverse Nation. In 1998, she received the National Humanities Medal from President Clinton for her work on religious pluralism. And in 2011, she delivered the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh on the age of pluralism. Her talk will discuss what on earth is pluralism for American life today, an important time in our country as we think about diversity, as we think about division, as we think about coming together. And so very, very pleased that you've come to help us understand what this means. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Let me begin by recognizing how conscious we are of the fact that it was really 2 years ago, these days, that we had such a momentous event, the Hamas attack and breaching the borders of Israel, and the death of many people, well over 1,000 on that first day, including those young people who were at a music festival, and the taking of hostages, and ensuing over the next, 2 years now, an extensive war in Gaza. It's hard to go through these days without remembering that time. And here at Harvard, that was a time of real divisiveness. I think if any of you were here, how many of you were at Harvard during that time? So you kind of remember this was a very stressful time. Almost immediately after that October 7th attack, then President Claudine Gay consulted with the deans of all the various Harvard schools, and they jointly issued a statement that was almost immediately attacked by other people, by donors, by even a former president of the university, as being not forceful enough or something. They revised that statement to make clear the depth of abhorrence that they felt for this attack. And it sort of unspooled from there, as you remember. There was also a statement of a small number of student groups that actually blamed Israel for the attack, saying that this was only part of a longer and very painful story of Palestinians. And the weeks and months that followed, literally right up to this time, became ever more fraught with division. And there were attacks from within, from without. There were Senate hearings that many of you may have followed, in which student slogans were then interpreted as calls for genocide. There was division on the campus. There were protests. There were people who were doxxed because of their participation in protest. Their names of those protesters and some Palestinian students went up on doxing trucks that circled around the university, accusing them of being Harvard's foremost anti-Semites, etc. And this feeling of fear and tension simply expanded. And it eventually led to more personal attacks on President Gay, eventually led to her resignation. And that maelstrom of trouble that was part of those days 2 years ago was also a time in which I was teaching a general education course on pluralism, a case studies course in which students came to class prepared to talk about the dilemmas that are faced in American life by all sorts of people, by educators, by city council people, by mayors, by CEOs, virtually every part of American life where the dilemmas of our increased complexity were on the table. And so I was teaching through this time, and it was really interesting. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But by January of 2024, interim President Garber, now the president of Harvard, called for the creation of 2 task forces. One, a task force to listen on the campus to issues of anti-Semitism, and the other, a task force on Islamophobia, anti-Islamic, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian feeling. I was actually put on that second task force, and we were going about listening to students and to staff and to people at all the schools about what was happening. And then eventually, there came to be a subcommittee of these 2 task forces on pluralism. And that comprised some of us from both task forces, and eventually developed what came to be, in our words, a framework for a culture of pluralism at Harvard. And we've seen all sorts of things happen since then. An Office of Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life, a Director of Interfaith Engagement, situated in the President's office. That's Rabbi Getzel Davis now. And then over these years, we've also seen, and those of you in this room know quite well, the sort of gradually dismantling of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging initiatives, basically at the behest of the Trump administration, not only in universities, but in corporations, in the military, and other places as well. And so it is that we no longer have an Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity and Belonging at Harvard, but an Office for Community and Campus Life, that's over in FAS, and you guys have an Office for Culture and Community, or Community and Belonging. Everything has sort of changed its name, and And there has been what some have called a pivot to pluralism, that we're talking about pluralism. Who knows how long it will be before pluralism itself comes under attack. But anyway, that's where we are. And so I think we can come back to some of those issues, and I'd like to. But now I want to start sort of in a different place with the genesis of the Pluralism Project, and I put their website here on the screen. That story begins more or less with my upbringing in the state of Montana. Grew up in the mountains of Montana in a town, a lovely town called Bozeman. And there, before I went east to college, I had scarcely met anyone who was Jewish, and I certainly hadn't met very many African Americans. But it was also a time of tremendous division and disturbance. I went off to college at a sweet and rather sleepy little place at the time, Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. And on my way, I went with my Methodist student friends. I was on the Methodist Student Movement, the National Methodist Youth Fellowship, and we went to the March on Washington in Washington, D.C., where Martin Luther King spoke and where there was such a huge crowd. That was my first stop on my way to college. And then in the spring of my freshman year, some of us went back to DC and lobbied for the Civil Rights Bill. And this was a time when, if you were to take the temperature of colleges and universities, there was a lot of division, a lot of turmoil over the issues of civil rights, and mixed in with that over the issues of our involvement in Vietnam and the Vietnam War. So this was also a time of incredible turbulence. And it was during that time that I felt, well, I'd had 2 years at Smith by then. And I thought, well, I'd like to go on a junior year abroad, as many people did. And yet the ones that Smith had on offer were in Paris or Geneva or Spain or somewhere. No, I'd kind of like to go to what we then called somewhere in the third world, a little closer to the turmoil in Vietnam, but you couldn't possibly go there. So I found a program that was sponsored by the University of Wisconsin in India. And I applied. I told my parents, who were very apprehensive about this business, but I said it wouldn't cost any more than just going to college, because at that point, the United States and India had a very uneven balance of trade. The US sent lots and lots of wheat to India, and India could not pay in dollars. So rather than that, the US sent lots of people like me over to India to spend that money in rupees. And so it was that I went for my junior year. I spent an entire year at Banaras Hindu University, a place that was extremely different from anywhere I had ever been before, and where the dominant ethos was Hindu. And yet Banaras was also very much a multi-religious place. That's where I first heard the call to prayer of the Muslims there. The wonderful retreat on the edge of Banaras called Sarnath, where the Gautama, who became the Buddha, preached his first sermon, and a Jain center. It was a multi-religious city. And the more time I spent there, the more I realized that I actually wanted to study religion. That's what I did when I finally went back to Smith. I changed my major and graduated in religion. But in the meantime, that was 1965. And that was a year in which the third big bill of the civil rights movement was passed. Robert Kennedy had been the Attorney General, and he noted in the course of his brother's administration that we as Americans could not be working to end racial discrimination in every aspect of our national life, as had been the hope of the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill. But we couldn't do this and simultaneously maintain race as a cornerstone of our immigration policy, which it was. I mean, we had what you would have to call a racist, culturally discriminate immigration policy, primarily focused on immigration from Europe. But the 1965 Immigration and Nationalities Act that was signed into law by President LBJ, based on the Statue of Liberty, opened the doors to immigration from India and other parts of the Middle East and Asia. So from the standpoint of India, where I was studying that year, 1965, this was something that was referred to as the brain drain, where doctors and scientists and folks who were in new forms of technology, the ones who eventually formed the basis of the Silicon Valley revolution, were those people lined up to get visas and come to the United States, which they did. So India saw it as the brain drain, and I took note of that. But it never occurred to me what it would mean for the United States at that point. And President Johnson said in his speech as he signed that bill, surrounded by senators from both sides, that this would not essentially change much about American life, but it would correct an enduring wrong in the conduct of the American people. And he was right about that, to correct an enduring wrong that had underlain our immigration policy. But he was quite wrong about how much it would change America, because we did then begin to experience not just the people who came to do their graduate work in physics and engineering and medicine in the United States, but they're settling in the US and eventually having families here and kids here. And by the late 1980s, I was teaching comparative religion at Harvard, and suddenly the classes were totally different. I had Hindu kids in the class who had gone to summer camp in the Poconos. I had Muslim kids who had been to Muslim youth leadership camps in Chicago or elsewhere. So the campus itself became so much more diverse. And that is really not only what happened in American higher education. I've often said if I'd been teaching first grade, I would have realized all of this much earlier. But honestly, the total composition of Harvard College and of colleges and universities across the country had changed to become much more diverse. And that was true of American life in general. And we had become virtually a multicultural nation, a multi-religious nation. And once that diversity began to move into the mainstream of American life, we began to see what it meant to speak of we, the people of the United States of America, in a broader sense. And that migration of peoples by virtue of immigration and by virtue of economic and political displacement affected countries all over the world, but among them, our own country. And so as the 1990s dawned, I thought, well, you know, I need to know more about this. I had never been to a mosque in Boston, for example. I didn't even know where they were. I had never seen the consecration, the Kumbha Abhisheka, as they call it, of a Hindu temple. But there was happening the consecration of a Hindu temple right out on the outskirts of Boston, in Ashland, virtually on the route of the Boston Marathon. So this began to intrigue me. I gathered together a seminar of undergraduate and graduate students, and we went out to look for what was happening in Boston. Now, mind you, this is a couple of years before Netscape Navigator arrived, so we couldn't really Google this, and Google was a long ways off too. So we had to, find out where people were worshiping and living, and it was sort of by word of mouth, but we developed the beginning of a whole map of Boston that now we have expanded into a World Religions in Boston book and website that actually is used by all sorts of agencies and folks in Boston. About this time, there was a research project going on at the University of Chicago to investigate the radical fundamentalists in every tradition across the globe. It was called the Fundamentalism Project. And I was vaguely interested in this, but I didn't really want to join in that research. I was much more interested not in the radicals who at that point were seizing planes and throwing bombs, but in the ways in which people were actually coming together to get to know each other or to work on projects together. And so that's where I landed on the notion of pluralism, that if I were going to study something that was happening in the religious life of our world, I wanted to know more about the bridges that were being built rather than the ones that were being torn down. And so it began, and I'll turn here. This is our website. It's been put in a new sort of sleeve over the last couple of months. So I will just let you have a look at it. I will show you some bits of it, and then let you find your way to it on your own. But here it asks, what is pluralism? And then I think I can find where I say something about it. And the first thing I would say is that pluralism isn't just diversity. People think about diversity. Diversity is where it all begins because we are different. We are diverse. That's a fact. That is not somehow a sort of left-leaning conspiracy. That's actually who we are. It is a fact of American life. But pluralism isn't diversity alone. It's how to engage with that diversity, what to make of it. Because we can be diverse and live in silos or in sort of ghettos with very little knowledge of one another, or we can reach out and try to know more about each other as well. And I think mere diversity without real encounter and relationship is going to be very flimsy and yield increasing tensions in our society. Second, that pluralism isn't just about tolerance, but the active seeking of understanding. Tolerance, of course, is a good public virtue, but it doesn't require Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus to know anything about one another. Doesn't require ardent secularists to know anything about religion, really. Does nothing to remove the ignorance we have very often of one another. And it leaves in place the kind of stereotypes and half-baked truths that underlie old patterns of division. and violence. So yes, I mean, our ignorance of one another will be increasingly costly. And third, pluralism isn't relativism. We don't have to leave our ideologies or our beliefs behind, but rather encounter one another with the full range of what it is we deeply believe. What is our faith? What is our hope and vision? And holding our differences not in opposition, though they may sometimes be in opposition, not in isolation from each other, but in relationship to each other. So pluralism isn't just tolerance. It's not a kind of wishy-washy relativism. And fourth, the language of pluralism is a two-way language. It is the language of dialogue, of speaking and listening, of criticism and self-criticism. It is not a language that will produce agreement all the time. It certainly won't. Pluralism, therefore, is sort of commitment to being at the table, wherever that so-called table is. Might be the dinner table, which is also a place that's increasingly diverse in our society, but the tables are many. They include city councils, they include corporations, they include universities and classrooms. So pluralism actually demands something of us. It demands the give and take, the traffic of relationship. And our belonging as citizens is not premised on cultural or religious agreement, but with an ethic of pluralism, we can have a society in which everyone belongs and has a stake in who we, the people, actually are. And so the Pluralism Project began with the sense that we do need to know more about one another. And so we have produced over the years a kind of educational platform where you can learn. You can learn general things about 15 different religious communities. You can learn about their presence in the United States. You can learn about their history in the United States. You can learn about their experience as people of faith in the US. You can learn about their festivals, the Festival of Holi, which you see in the lower right there. And we have not only timelines that take us through the world, but also a history of Hinduism in the United States as well. So the idea that we actually need to know about each other is embedded here. Certainly during the time of COVID, this became a really important resource for teachers because you have a whole range of things you can learn about, and they are in a sort of virtual classroom. So we asked a couple of kinds of questions. First, who's here in the American context? What is our religious landscape look like now? And here you can see the map of Boston, where you can kind of go and look at the various religious centers in Boston. Each of those will, and I won't bother you with those, will open up a little page, a place where there is a Hindu temple or one thing or another. And I think there is also a sense, I'm not sure how this is put together, but of landmarks that religious communities have not just rented halls and worship, but put down roots in the American soil. the Medicine Wheel, a Christian cathedral in Puerto Rico, John Bowne House in New York, which was the sort of Quaker stand for religious pluralism in Flushing, led to the Flushing Remonstrance, the first Jewish synagogue in Truro in Rhode Island, African Baptist Church in Georgia, a Buddhist Joss House in California, Shinto Shrine, the Hindu Vedanta Society in California, the Pacific Coast Khalsa Diwan Gurdwara in Stockton, 1915, and Confucian Muslim, the Mother Mosque of America, where in Iowa, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the first of the great mosques in America, and the Interfaith Chapel at the Air Force. And anyway, so you get a little bit of a sense of what the main composition of our landscape is, right down to the humanists. And this place, which I will return to a bit, the Tri-Faith Center in Omaha, Nebraska, where a church, an Islamic center, and a synagogue have co-located, built new places for their congregation. So, yeah. Anyway, so where are these people? That's the other thing. And at a time when we didn't really do very much about a religious census in the United States, this provides a sense of who we have become. Because just as my ancestors, who mainly came from Sweden, came to the US and sought out wherever there was a Swedish Lutheran church where people would speak Swedish, that's what happened with all of these communities. Then we look at the ways in which they have encountered one another, both historically and today. And sometimes those encounters are in sort of informal ways. Sometimes they're in the courts, sometimes they're in the public sphere, like the big protests after the so-called Muslim ban. What are the challenges that people face today? And then we did a lot with interfaith, with the ways in which people, and that was sort of the idea I had when I thought about bridging and pluralism and whatnot. What kinds of interfaith practices are there? What kinds of organizations where a council of churches has become a council of Christians and Jews, or an Abrahamic council, or something else, you know? And there are many, many examples of this. I will look at some of the films, and we made a couple of films ourselves, but this one in particular takes us back to Omaha, where a mosque, a synagogue, a church, and an interfaith center have been constructed side by side. And this film, called Abraham's Bridge, is a film that takes us into the heart of that rather radical experiment. This was made by Ellie Pierce, who was my right-hand person in the Pluralism Project. And I'll show you just a little bit of the trailer of this, because at some point it might be good to have that film shown here. This is Abraham's Bridge. It's a circular bridge that goes around and sort of links these various centers. And she's been showing this at film festivals all over the place. In the middle of the bridge is a sort of field that has become a community garden that harvests tons and tons of food for the food banks in Omaha. And here is a bit of a trailer from that film where you see it in the dead of winter in different seasons over a little creek that's called Hell Creek. And that is the creek that the bridge passes. Can you hear this? But it does not define us. And you can see these buildings that have been built there are quite spectacular in their own way. And the fact that these communities have built together, moved congregations into that space together, it's an extraordinary thing. And one of the things that is interesting about this tri-faith community in Omaha is that from the very beginning, they have had to face the fact that most of the members of the Islamic community are Palestinian. The Jewish community, they have relatives, family, everyone in Israel. And as for the Christian communities, the Episcopalians have a hospital in Gaza. The presence of Christianity there is also important. And there was a sense, we wrote an early case study of this called Gaza in Nebraska, where we began to look at what it meant for people half a world away who were trying to do something very different to contend with the divisions of the Middle East. And that issue continued, right? In the film, you begin to see this again. They always said, well, you know, eventually we're going to take up these really tough issues. But first we need to build trust. We need to get to know each other. We need to do all of these things. And suddenly, after October 7th, there was no more time. They actually had to begin to address what some would call the elephant in the room. And that, you know, that is something that's happened time and again. Now, I am going to go to the third part of this, which is the case initiative. And I, over the years, have loved lecturing. I would get my 2 projectors of my slides, then I would get my PowerPoints rolling and all sorts of things. And then I realized, partly because President Derek Bach was a great researcher on the facts of education, that I was the person who learned most by being able to put all of this together, that students learn in quite a different way. by coming to class prepared and by discussing things that are easy, things that are difficult, and in this case, discussing cases. Now, the whole of Harvard Business School is run on a case study method, and I'm sure this is pretty much true for medical schools as well. You have cases one after another after another. And so what are the issues? What are the dilemmas that face us in all these different areas of life? And so I began to teach in quite a different way, which is through the case method. And they would study a case like this one, adding Eid, that is about the request of parents and the PTA at Cambridge Public Schools to add Eid to the school calendar, not just for Muslim students, but for everyone. So what does the superintendent of schools do about this? How does he make a decision? Who should make the decision? This is not just for Muslim students, but for everyone, including the custodial staff and the teachers and the parents who have their kids home from school for another day. So that question, it's come up time and again in school districts across the country. That begins the discussion. This one, Driven by Faith, is about Minneapolis, Minnesota, where most of the taxi drivers are from you just said it, Somalia. Yes, sorry. And like 80% of the taxi drivers at the airport are Somalis. And they will not pick up passengers who are carrying alcohol. So what to do? Whose problem is this? Is it the head of the airport? Is it the line manager? Is it the Taxi Drivers Association? Who's going to deal with this? Driving a taxi is one of the best ways for Somali young immigrants to get their way and get just a little bit of a leg up so they can go to school or something else. So that becomes the dilemma. And that's a dilemma that students will have to discuss and make sense of. There are no actually right answers on this. There are many others, but I think maybe the call to prayer has to do with Hamtramck, Michigan, where a Bengali Islamic center wants to issue a broadcast call to prayer from its roof. And Hamtramck is a very, very tightly knit suburb of Detroit and has been largely Polish and Catholic until recently, when there are lots of Muslims. So the Polish grandmothers do not want to hear the call to prayer in their ears. No, they do not. And what is the difference between hearing the call to prayer and hearing the sound of bells? Is there a difference? So these are some of the questions. And then the one that I will ask you a little bit about here, and I'm going to need to find it, see all the case studies. Now, we do have a book of case studies that is called The Practice of Pluralism, but this is the one I would like to have a little bit of get some of your advice. It's called Sign of Division. And this takes place in Sharon, Massachusetts, right out here, the most Muslim suburb, you might say, or the most Jewish suburb of Boston. That's where the Jewish cemetery is. There are at least half a dozen synagogues and temples there. And there is an Islamic center built on an old horse farm outside of Sharon. There's an interfaith student group in the high school that has now planned a seasons of celebration, seasons of light. And it will take place in the backyard of one of the synagogues. It will include both people from the temple, from the Jewish communities, from the Hindu communities nearby, and from the Islamic community, where they have canceled their own iftar for that evening, so that all the members of that community can come to this Seasons of Light celebration. On the day that is to take place, and students are there getting all set up and doing the cooking, and they've spent the summer finding things like kosher basmati rice, and suddenly they realize that in the lobby of this synagogue is a big sign that says, "We support Israel." So what should we do? Should they take it down? Put it in the closet for the night? Who can make that decision? Should they leave it up? And if they do, what are all these Muslims going to feel when they come into this place for the first time, most of them in any kind of Jewish community? What will they feel being confronted with this sign as a first step? Should they try to adjust their program of celebration to talk about it? Well, that's a difficult issue even for all the adults to talk about. What are the risks? What are the risks of leaving it up? What are the risks of taking it down? How does the notion of interfaith hospitality collide with the notion of identity? If you have someone come to your home, do you remove sort of religious items from the lobby or from the front door? How do we deal with that? I mean, just as a quick thought, how many of you think that it would be good to leave that sign up? You're going doot, doot, doot. How many of you think it would be good to take it down? Are there any other possibilities? Is there a third choice, maybe? Yeah?
Put up a sign next to it that says we support Gaza.
We support Gaza. You could put one next to it. And then how would that be dealt with during the discussion over dinner? I mean, and you realize that even within, the congregation of that synagogue, there are probably very different views of this. So, this is the place where the discussion kind of begins. And this actually was one of the discussions we were having during the maelstrom of the fall semester 2 years ago. They handled it really well, and were able, because it's not about let's solve the problem in the Middle East. It's about something much more sort of confined, defined, what to do about this sign in relation to an interfaith celebration. And yet it has resonances that move beyond that and that involve people's feelings, their thoughts, their emotions. And of course, emotion is always part of these dilemmas that people face. Anyway, so that's sort of one of the case studies, sign of division, that I like to point to. And we have some others as well that raise questions. In fact, all of them raise questions that are very large in one way, but also by being a particular case, enable us to discuss it without feeling that we are, trampling into the whole world of politics and the emotion that goes with politics.
Did this actually happen at this?
It did actually happen. All of these actually happened. Yes. Mm-hmm. And what happened finally? Okay, so they went down to the office of the rabbi, and asked him this question, and he immediately said, "Take it down. Put it away for the night. That is not what this evening is about. If you were to have a film series here next week, we would leave it up. But for this time, we need to remember the ways in which the Torah asks us to treat the stranger. And we want to treat the strangers tonight with hospitality." So, you know, it was actually a pretty good theological answer when it comes right down to it. Yeah. So, but these are the dilemmas that we have in our university today. And I'm going to turn then to, just for a moment, to the thing I raised at the beginning about this joint committee on pluralism that was the off-spinning of the two task forces. The task forces themselves, we were listening, went around and listened to students and to faculty and to staff. In our case, to students who were Arab American, Muslim, even Palestinians, students who had felt frightened, who had been doxxed by the big doxing trucks that rolled around. And of course, the task force on anti-Semitism also listened to students who were fearful, who felt that they were looked at in a sort of threatening way, or who were harassed in one way or another. So the Joint Task Force on Pluralism, I think, was something that, you know, pretty much was agreed on by both task forces as something we needed. And the definition there is, we understand a culture of pluralism to entail a recognition that we are a campus where people are diverse in their identities, divergent in their ideologies, and where the concept of identity ranges broadly across race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, geographic background, etc. And that there's diversity within each of those groups as well. Where even within a given identity, there is much diversity, where we respect, relate, and cooperate with each other, where the specific project of our cooperation is to advance an educational and research mission where all can learn and grow, where therefore we bear a responsibility for the quality of the relationships that support the cooperative project of learning, and where that work requires that we connect our personal values and commitments to the shared civic virtues of our campus, as expressed in the university values statement, linking our personal identity and Harvard's civic identity. And that some members of the campus have felt supported by diversity initiatives, but a pluralism framework seemed to be more holistic. And how exactly is it different? What someone in the New Yorker who wrote about this called the pivot to pluralism in relation to issues that had previously been identified under the umbrella of DEI. Well, you know, going back to 2018, Harvard had a task force to look into diversity and belonging, and you know, came up with some of these kinds of offices that have existed. When I first came to Harvard, there was no such thing as diversity, equity, belonging, inclusion. And the terms are difficult, really. I mean, diversity, again, is just a fact. You can't sort of stuff it back into the bag and say, sorry, this is going to be, or in, you know, a governmental sense, this is going to be a Christian nation now with white Christian nationalists at the helm. It's too late for that. As we'd say in Montana, the horses have already left the barn. They were all over the place. We've settled, we're here. This is the fact of our country, that we are diverse. Pluralism begins with that diversity. And so we need to find ways in which to teach into that, to connect diversity and equity with the classroom. And that's where my case studies came in. I used to try to get other people interested in case studies. Over at the business school, all the professors who do case studies meet together and talk about how they're going to teach this particular case. I had a few teaching fellows, and that was about it. It's very hard to break professors of the habit of lecturing. They love to lecture and see their own, lectures being copied down by the students. I used to like that too. I liked my lectures. But anyway, and then the question of inclusion, which is a very difficult word, because inclusion is something that people do to you. I want to include you in my group. And, those of us who are women in the university can remember when they wanted to include a lot more women on the faculty. And when I was appointed, I was probably number 40 on the whole of the Harvard faculty. Inclusion. But inclusion is tricky. You can be included in something that you have no voice in. And so I don't know about that word, inclusion. Belonging is something only you can feel, if you feel that you belong. And, I can't think of the number of banners that they put up in Harvard Yard that just said something simple like, "You belong," because a lot of people felt they didn't belong. Anyway, all of you have seen what has happened over these years, which partly comes from the highest levels of our government, that somehow diversity has created its own problems. And, even our former president was seen as maybe a diversity hire, that sort of thing. This sort of attack on DEI has basically led to all sorts of things in the military, in our corporations, in our schools, and you are in this room sort of in the front lines of this. You've seen what happened, and now we have various other things that are community and culture, culture and community, community and belonging. A lot of them are sort of the reshuffled deck of offices of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, but with a different sense of a mission. So the Pluralism Initiative, I didn't dream this up. I got the URL 25 years ago or 30 years ago, so that's us. But the fact that the university is now thinking to make this a framework for its work with what is simply a very diverse group of students and faculty, always wasn't the case, but is now. So pluralism has become the new buzzword, and we'll see how long that lasts and what it comes to mean, because it is something that you have to create. It is not bestowed, and it needs to be created partially by incorporating this into this diversity of voices into our educational framework. And alas, I'm no longer teaching my general education course on pluralism, but I think the use of case studies as a way of defining something more manageable for people to discuss and disagree about and talk about is certainly one way forward. Now I'm going to stop there and look forward to Joan and the questions that you might ask. Thank you. Mhm. Yep. Mhm. I think we have two chairs. Should we just sit side by side? Here. Mhm. I don't think we need this either, really.
Sit like we know each other,
Okay, here.
or we belong together.
Yeah, we do. We kind of do. Let me just go up here. We can at least put that back up, and
Perfect.
that's perfect. Okay.
I thank you for that. For me, as I listen to this, one of the things that, two things strike me, is that you're prescient and you got the URL early, which is very good.
Mhm.
But also the ways in which words can have different meanings for different people and different places at different points in time.
Do. Mhm.
And so the concept of diversity just is just a fact, that each and every one of us is diverse. The way in which we at the medical school had framed part of this diversity is in very much the way that you talk about pluralism. It wasn't so much what does the picture look like or
Mhm.
those kinds of things,
Yeah.
but it's about having a voice and feeling like you can prosper, that you
Yes.
can contribute, that you can make a difference in that space and you're seen
Yes.
and heard. At the same time, if we look at part of what's going on within our country now, it's being interpreted in a different way. And so words come, they go, and right now that diversity word is on the out. At the same time, that diversity still exists. When I think about the cases that you have developed in with a religion or religious focus, can you talk to us a little bit about how does that get interpreted into other spaces? And so we have this being co-sponsored with the dental school and the School of Public Health and the medical school. But part of what I heard in these cases was there is a dilemma that could exist anywhere. Can you talk a little bit about how this can get translated in other spaces, its cases?
I mean, certainly. I mean, I think the space of a corporate, like the Minneapolis airport people, they had to, I mean, this is a corporation. They need to think about all sorts of things that are not necessarily religious issues. I'm sure in a hospital, there are situations, there are dilemmas that have to do with when does life end? Does it end when there's brain death or when one stops breathing? We had two students who actually developed a case like this in a Rhode Island hospital, where there was a real sense among the young, I mean, the Cambodian, I think they were, the folks who had a relative who was pronounced to be dead and yet was still breathing. How do you decide? And what are the medical dilemmas? I'm sure there are many. The issues of vaccinations these days, I think, is probably another space where we have sort of disagreement about what is effective. For folks who grew up as I did, looking at the pictures of people in iron lungs, it became very clear when we all lined up in second grade and got our polio shots. But, these were not areas of dilemma or of disagreement. Probably one of the biggest is how things are interpreted in the media. I mean, we have one case that deals with the Islamic community that wanted to build an Islamic community center within a few blocks of Ground Zero. And they got approval from the Lower Manhattan committee and everything. And the very next day, in one of the New York newspapers, it was announced that an 11-story mosque was going to be built there, which was totally wrong. It was a misinterpretation, but the way the media interprets things also is, really significant. And of course, we see this now with, all the ways in which what people think of as might be news is manufactured and manipulated. We haven't quite gotten into all of that, and I think that's really important.
When I think about where we are today, then and some of the work that came from the Pluralism Task Force, and part of what you talked about today was around teaching and education with students. But I see part of this as being an issue, not just for the classroom with students, but how do we relate as faculty, as staff with one another? Some thoughts about how this can translate into how we interact and interface on our everyday workspace and environment, so that it doesn't become, I don't know how you move to a culture of pluralism when you focus only in the classroom.
You're absolutely right. I mean, because the context in which we encounter each other is, in committee meetings, in offices, at the, water fountain, all sorts of places where our conversations may, enter into this zone of how we appreciate one another, how we come to acknowledge that we're different because we're not all the same, how we inquire about one another, how we ask questions. We know that there are observances and holidays and things that our colleagues are involved in. Sometimes we're very hesitant about asking. And, there used to be diversity trainings that I would pop in on at Harvard, mainly for staff, I would say. Nobody ever addressed religion in these diversity trainings because somehow this was considered way too sensitive. We can't get into that. And yet that is really one of the things about one another that can be most interesting. Why is it that you pour orange all over the gods, for example? Why is it that at Holy you fling colored powder at one another? What is this about anyway? I mean, there's a kind of level of festivity that's really extraordinary. Across from where I live in Cambridge is the Cambridge Public Library. And for the last few years, the Muslim community put up a Ramadan celebration tent, a big tent where they would offer iftar to anyone, to all the people who would come. And now they didn't do it this year, and I had a sense that maybe, people are getting a little more tense about this as well. But yeah, I mean, there's so many ways in which we are fearful of addressing our differences or of explaining our own, I mean, I grew up in a Methodist church where there were a lot of things about how you couldn't dance or drink liquor or all sorts of things, but that wasn't the stuff that we were taught. We were taught about, social action. My very first demonstration was in downtown Bozeman when our governor refused to proclaim United Nations Day. And I was one of those kids who went out trick-or-treating for UNICEF. So anyway.
Absolutely. Questions, comments?
Thank you so much for such an enlightening and thought-provoking talk, and also congratulations on your incredible body of work. So I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on, especially scholars like you and Dr. Reed who deal with these issues every day, this whole reconciling of free speech and hateful rhetoric, and where the line crosses, and then how cancel culture comes in.
That's a real good question. I mean, free speech, I think, does sometimes include speech that is hateful, but cannot be advocating violence. I mean, that's, it's one thing to shout out your views. It's another thing to shout fire in a crowded theater, for example. So free speech, yes. But free speech is interpreted in many different ways. I mean, we had students at Harvard and elsewhere who had all sorts of protest slogans during the first days of the war in Gaza, where they would say things like, from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free. Now, what does it mean, really? I mean, for them, it is a sort of slogan of protest. When this was investigated by that Senate committee headed by Elise Stefanik, that very slogan ceased to be something of a student protest slogan and became sort of, through almost a rhetorical sleight of hand, a call for genocide. And that wasn't what students were saying. They would all deny that this was a call for genocide. But the notion of free Palestine, which, was on the lips of probably 1,000 people, students and others who walked out of Harvard commencement that year, is interpreted in different ways. And, this whole question of how do you explain to someone who doesn't share your history some of the aspects of your history that are painful. And so to compare the Nakba, for example, with the Holocaust. Our current dean of the Divinity School spoke of some of the real crises in today's world. And one of them, as we move through the years, was the Nakba, the horrible moment when, a couple 100,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes and have lived in refugee camps ever since. How do we address things like that when the words mean things very differently in the ears of the receiver? And that it can only really happen by sustained dialogue. And I mean sustained dialogue. I don't mean a weekend where you exchange views or an evening at the Kennedy School or something like that. It has to be sustained. Mm-hmm.
I would add to this idea of real dialogue, not just what the media says or just expressing perspectives, which is partly what I see happening. Mm-hmm. But it's taking it to that next level of understanding how those perspectives came to be and the context and the history. And I think for many of the discussions, not just subsequent to October 7th, but on many different levels, the history is not told. We start with where we are today as though something came out of the blue.
Yeah.
And not taking into an understanding of how we got here. And so when you ask that, and I think about this as an academic institution, how do we also understand the history, how the history plays out today, how there are these different perspectives on what a word might mean and what is being said mm-hmm. and why. And for me, that dialogue is that opportunity to learn, yes. to understand better, to not point to you're right and I'm wrong, but to say, how do we create the space so that we at least begin to understand what each other is saying and we both grow in the process. Yeah. And agree that it's not a one-time thing. This is not well, I read a book yesterday, I know it all. This is about creating space for conversations and respect. I think one of the and I say this as a physician, one of the advantages of being in this space is a deep respect for all humanity and all life. And how do we bring that forward in this space and in these conversations?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for showcasing your wonderful work and your
Thank you.
project. Well, over 15 years ago, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, I think it was at the time David Cameron, who issued a statement saying that multiculturalism has failed in the UK. Now, regardless whether his statement was true or false, but do you feel that here in the US, the social fabric in the US faces similar challenges as they are in the UK in terms of multi-faith and multicultural communities? And if so, how do we overcome them?
Well, I think the challenges are the same. They're a little different because of the fact that Britain, has had a state religion. The Church of England, and even when Charles became king, he did say that he would be not just defender of the faith, but defender of faith in general. And at his coronation, you'll recall there were Muslims and Sikhs and Jains and others. And you can say it, I don't know if it was a bit of failure in England. I mean, the famous mayor of part of London, I forget his name now, but a Muslim mayor of a significant part of London, and Rishi Sunak, who was Hindu, as prime minister. I mean, it hasn't been a complete failure. And even Queen Elizabeth finally went to a Hindu temple and had her little sort of booties put on her shoes and maybe got a little tilak on her forehead. I don't know. But in the United States, I think it's a little more local in many ways. I mean, the arising of interfaith communities in cities and towns all over the place is something that is unmatched in basically any European country. And of course, because we have no state religion, have assiduously objected to having Christianity as any kind of state religion, it has meant that religion has flourished here in kind of a funny way. Even, as the French traveler Tocqueville said when he came to the US, somehow it happened in the US that by dismantling a state religion, religion has flourished. It became sort of a commodity almost, and anyone with a bulldozer now can build a new church. It's a kind of free-for-all. And in France, whereas religion and secularism marched in opposite directions, in the US, religion has flourished under so-called secularism. So, I think it's a way in which the US has kind of, religion is kind of a capitalist affair here. And it is true, however, that if you're going to be a religious community and want to raise money, you have to become a 501c3. You have to have a board of directors and a list of members. And for some people, this is their first exercise in democracy, as the Buddhist community yields its power to a board of directors, and the monk doesn't get to say everything. So, it's an interesting comparison, and I'm glad you asked.
I want to be respectful, and I'm not sure if there are any questions online. One of the things I'd say when I hear people say, well, multiculturalism didn't work, or whatever the term is at the point in time doesn't work, part of what I find fascinating is, what would it look like if it worked? I mean, is it like you wake up tomorrow morning and like nirvana, or like what does that mean? I see this as a continuous striving toward.
Yes. Mhm.
but not an arrival at, if this is how I would probably put it.
Yeah, I mean, if you start looking at the United States Congress, it used to be kind of memorable when there was one Sikh gentleman who was in Congress, and then the first Muslim, Keith Ellison, and the second Muslim, and now Hindus. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, for example, first Hindu, swore in on a copy of the Bhagavad Gita. So, you know, these sort of landmarks, you might say, are happening all the time. What does it mean when it works? It does mean that we have basically significant South Asian voting groups. They don't vote as a bloc, but there is a sense that, you know, if you're going to get elected to office in the city of New York, as Mamdani is now demonstrating, you need to be able to engage various cultural groups. And here we are. We all live together, and we have some things that demonstrate that. Maybe food is one of the things that is most salient in our multicultural basket. Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to thank you. Thank you for the work that you've done, the work that you have done to help prepare us for where we are today,
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
for sharing your time and your wisdom with us. And for me, it's giving us this challenge of, in this day and in this time, how do we continue to move forward together?
Yes.
So,
Well,
thank you.
and that is unwritten. I mean, the president may have, you know, decided that pluralism is the next big framework for thinking about the university. How we live into that is really up to us. It's not going to be, you know, fixed. There is a Building Bridges initiative that students can apply for money for $5,000 for some program. But it really is something that is left to be created. And that's what our job is.
Good.
Thank you so very much.